I don't like it when people claim that games as a medium has terrible writing, some going so far as to say that even the best games don't rise to the level of mediocre Hollywood movies. This is nonsense, of course, especially since the few games that did get Hollywood screenwriters or award-winning authors on board had stories that were guilty of the same cliches they condemned, while failing to deliver anything of note. The Evil Within is the game that those English literature snobs claim that all games are, an incoherent mess that feels like it's making it up as it goes along, while the gameplay fails to make up for the nonsense plot. It's at this point I would start summarising the story, but there's really no point. You play as 1950s grizzled detective man and half-brother of the Ride to Hell guy. He's called to back up some cops at a local hospital, is stabbed by a ghost man, and wakes up in horror cliché land. From there the story turns into incomprehensible nonsense. I call it horror cliché land because it rapidly ticks all the boxes for things seen in scary games, but with none of the consistency or setup those other games have. Rusty wheelchairs, abandoned hospitals, insane asylums, a butcher, a little girl with long black hair over her face, decapitation, mannequins, needles, rusty barbed wire, zombies, TVs displaying static, and so much blood and gore that it makes me wonder where it's coming from. All thrown together with no rhyme or reason. Scares are rarely properly constructed, and the ones that are can be quite effective. The same scares are used repeatedly as well. Multiple times there was a scene where a guy is facing away from the camera slowly zooms in, and he turns around to reveal a creepy face. Oddly enough, the most consistently effective scary scenes were the loading screens of all things, depicting things like a window with lightning strikes that sometimes revealed something scary or nothing at all, a flickering TV screen that sometimes shows a face, or a morgue slab moving slightly. Just to be clear, I don't really have a problem with this everything in the kitchen sink approach to horror. If it was presented as sort of a horror fun house, like something out of Time Splitters or Resident Evil 4, then I'd be fine with it. But it takes itself so seriously, and the lack of proper setups makes it feel random. It's a shame because with there being so much stuff here, there's bound to be something that gets under your skin or simply entertains as a cool set piece. There's a cool moment where you fall down a hole only to find yourself falling along a hallway, but this is reused with diminishing effect. Tone is a major problem of the game. One minute it'll be a supernatural, psychological horror game, almost like Silent Hill, but then it does something at odds with that tone, like having a giant spider chase a bus through city streets while you shoot dynamite throwing zombies. One cutscene has the main character do a backflip kick headshot to make his escape, like something out of Resident Evil 4, but then expects you to buy into the Silent Hill-esque tone in the very next scene. The upgrade chair, which is this scary contraption that looks like some kind of saw trap, uses needles to inject green goo into your brain so that you can carry more matches. Even the gameplay can be unintentionally funny, like a boss repeatedly respawning only to be immediately set on fire and killed like a horror-themed whack-a-mole, or enemies running into their own booby traps. But I'll get to the gameplay later because there's one more thing I want to mention: the characters. The plot makes no sense, but sometimes the characters pretend to know what's going on, which might be forgivable if they weren't so slow on the uptake in other areas, such as being constantly surprised by the nonsense rules of the world well past the point they should have stopped questioning things. Let me put it this way: imagine if it started raining apples, then the next day it started raining bananas, then the next day pineapples, and so on and so forth for a week. These characters would be stunned and surprised if on day 7 it started raining oranges, and talk about how they can't believe it's raining fruit and how none of this makes any sense, and oh, isn't it weird that fruit's falling from the sky? You should be used to it by this point. I said the characters pretend to know what's going on, and that's because they talk about other characters and what their plans are as if they know But I don't know who anybody is, or what the stakes are, or even if the things that are supposed to be happening are meant to be real or not. I was convinced early on that the characters were hooked up to some shared horror hallucination, and I was mostly correct. The game also does these twists, or at least the characters act like these are big revelations, when they made either no sense to me or were obvious from way before. There are also huge plot holes. Your character is immune to being turned into a zombie, but it's never explained why. This would be fine, but then he does turn into a zombie briefly, but then he gets better. The villain can teleport, can kill you by touching you, and wants you dead. Why doesn't he just teleport to you and kill you instantly? Never explained. You might have noticed that so far I've not really talked about the gameplay, but that's because the gameplay is its own can of worms that is largely subjective due to me having issues that a friend of mine didn't have. In general, the game is a slightly modernised take on Resident Evil 4 with many of the same mechanics in place, the enemies and weapons acting very similar to the way they did in that game. You collect money, green goo in this case, to buy weapon and character upgrades, only instead of a merchant it's the previously mentioned scary chair. One new mechanic is that you could burn bodies with a match to make sure they stayed dead. This is poorly explained though. The game leads you to believe that dead enemies will get back up unless they're burned, but in practice, dead enemies stay dead. This is more of a preventative measure to stop sleeping enemies from waking up and surprising you, or as a way to get a quick kill on a downed enemy. The game says that bodies close together will catch on fire, but there's no real way to move bodies around or manipulate them into falling in the same spot. You can exploit this burning mechanic to set living, standing enemies on fire, but that feels cheap. One problem is that the game is overly scripted. In one scene I was chased by a monster that can teleport between bodies. I was in a lift and there was a body in there, so I burned it. The monster teleported ahead of me and killed me. Turns out, burning the body in the lift causes you to lose. You're meant to leave that body alone so the boss can continue its scripted chase once you enter the lift. It's dumb. There is stealth in the game, but calling it a mechanic would be a stretch. You could crouch and do a backstab and that's basically it. You can't peek around corners. You can throw bottles to distract enemies, but it's inconsistent. You can set traps, but these alert the rest of the enemies once they go off. Outside of a few telegraphed areas, stealth is more frustrating than it's worth. But at least the combat's fun. Kind of. It's fun enough. Like Resident Evil 4, there's no advanced dodging or anything, but unlike Resident Evil 4, your character isn't empowered in other ways. You don't have any cool melee moves, and even shaking out of a grab doesn't knock other enemies away from you. There's some weird clunkiness to the combat. Sometimes enemies swing at you as normal, but other times they lock you into a canned get hit animation. It's as if they're doing an invisible grab that locks you into the canned animation. Your melee attacks knock enemies back, but only sometimes. Sprinting to the side is a good way to dodge attacks, but only sometimes. Now, I can't confirm this, and it could just be pure placebo, but it sometimes feels like the effectiveness and toughness of enemies is based on my character's health. See, I was never at full health for long, and when I was at full health, that's when it felt like the enemies would get melee immunity or would rush in with a full insta-grab, but when I was at low health I could last a good long while without getting hit, though that did leave me open to being one hit killed when I was eventually hit. Enemies drop ammo, health or goo, but again it feels rigged. Much like Bioshock Infinite or Half-Life Episode 2, it feels like drop rates and the amount you get are based on what you have. Have lots of ammo? Don't expect to find any. Health almost never dropped unless I had no syringes and was close to death. This wouldn't be a problem if your pockets weren't so tiny. You can only hold 16 handgun bullets at the start of the game. 8 shotgun shells is all you could carry without upgrades. This means that a holdout or boss fight can drain you completely and leave you with nothing unless you get lucky with item drops. This could be alleviated by the upgrade system, which allows you to buy upgrades to health, stamina, reload speed and bigger pockets. However, the game is so stingy with the upgrade goo, and because the game is stingy with ammo as well, I felt almost forced to take things like weapon power and crit rate just to get the most of what little I could find. It's a shame too, because just like Resident Evil 4, the game can be pretty fun when it's going for all-out action. But fun turns to frustration when I'm out of ammo and left cheesing the AI with matches and stun locking them with melee attacks, only to be grabbed from behind or hit with an invisible axe. It is for this reason I recommend playing on easy. Sure, that doesn't fix the atrocious writing or the horrible pop-in that happens during the cutscenes, but it does help with the gameplay problems. The greater drops of both ammo and upgrade goo allow you to dabble with fun or convenience upgrades without screwing yourself over, and there's no need to worry that missing an item or bad drop will screw you over later in the game. And finally, I want to mention the odd technical problems. I know this is nitpicking at this point, but I wanted to mention them. The sniper rifle scope would often have a white filter over it. I don't know why. One consistent glitch I had throughout my playthrough was the character's footsteps would go out of sync with his walking. So instead of step, 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 it would be step, step, then a pause, step, step, then a pause, step, step. Here, listen to this clip. Is The Evil Within worth playing though? It's hard to say, but I'm going to say no. If you get it on sale, have the right mindset, and play it on easy, then maybe. The writing is nonsense that straddles the line between so bad it's good and so bad it's awful. There's some interesting monster designs, visuals and set pieces to see, and it's everything including the kitchen sink approach to horror means that there's bound to be something that you find unnerving or cool. The gameplay, for me at least, was too frustrating on normal difficulty, but a friend said he didn't have any trouble playing it on normal difficulty and didn't mention getting tripped up by scripted events. So what do I know?
A church.